Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and of course, this is History 475. We just finished video number 6. We finished with our short discussion of the Republic of West Florida. And so today we are going to continue our discussion of the Jefferson administration, and we will delve rather deeply into the events that take place prior to the beginning of the War of 1812, the events that led up to the War of 1812. Now, before we do that, there's something important that we need to discuss, though. An event that we need to discuss, and that event is the explorations of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Um, Now that Jefferson knew that we owned Louisiana, we might not have known what its exact boundaries were, but we owned it. Jefferson would have made a really good scientist today. Jefferson had an inquisitive mind. He knew a lot of stuff about a lot of things. Um, I've always loved the quote of President John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was hosting a uh, fancy dinner for, I think it was for Nobel Prize winners. All right. We're talking about brainy people. We're talking about extraordinarily smart people. And they were all gathered together in the White House in one spot, and they were being honored by President Kennedy. And Kennedy, during his remarks, said, and I love this, he said, never in the history of the United States has more brain power been assembled in one place, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. I think that's great. But it also is indicative of Jefferson's intellect. There have been presidents that have been as smart as Jefferson, but I'm not. I mean, John Adams, right? Uh, Madison, John Quincy Adams, Woodrow Wilson, sure. But I don't think any of them have ever been more intelligent than Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Well, one of Jefferson's interests was geography. And so he wanted to. No one knew anything, and no one knew anything about the Louisiana Purchase. They just knew it was out there and it was huge. And so, one of the first things that Jefferson does after we buy Louisiana is that he sends two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, on an expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase. And so the exploration, the expedition begins in the year 1804, starts in St. Louis. Now, if you know your geography, you know that the Missouri River hits the Mississippi River near the city of St. Louis, Missouri. So they start in St. Louis. They go up the Missouri River uh, into North Dakota. Uh, Along the way, they meet a French guide, probably a trapper, a French guide, and his Shoshone wife, Shoshone, remember the Shoshone Indian tribe, his Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. And of course, we know about Sacagawea because her image, of course, we have no photographs of her or anything, but the stylized image of Sacagawea now appears on one of the United States $1 coins. Um, they, along with the Frenchman and Sacagawea and other members of the expedition, they were not the only two, but along with everyone, they crossed the Continental Divide. They travel down the Snake and Columbia Rivers, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, I'm giving you absolutely a thumbnail sketch of what they did. Along the way, they were drawing pictures and making descriptions of the animals and the wildlife and the plant life that they saw, their personal thoughts on what it was that they were seeing, the significance of it. Those journals, by the way, still exist. When they get to the Pacific Ocean, they split into two parties. Lewis returned by using almost the same route as was used on the way, while Clark made a different route. He came down through Yellowstone, and they reunite at the juncture of the Missouri and the Yellowstone River. And then they return from that point. They return to St. Louis together. And they get back in 1806. They're gone for 2 years. Their reports attracted trappers and traders and eventually settlers into that part of the continent. And because they made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which was obviously outside of the Louisiana Territory, right? I mean, no one had ever claimed that Louisiana went all the way to the Pacific. It was supposed to have ended on the east side of the Rocky Mountains, or at the summit of the Rocky Mountains on the east side. But back then, now we laugh at it today. We say, oh, that's so silly. But back then, explorers would claim new land on behalf of their king, or in the case of Lewis and Clark, it was claimed on behalf of the United States of America. That land that they traveled through on the way to the Pacific Ocean was known for years as the Oregon Territory. And later, the state of Washington and the state of Oregon would be divided from it. But uh, they were the first Americans to see the Oregon Territory. At about the same time, the British government would send explorers of their own uh, by way of the Pacific Ocean, and they would see the Oregon Territory. Both the United States and Great Britain claimed the same land, right? The Oregon Territory. Now, normally, two countries claiming the same land would have been a recipe for disaster. It would have led to warfare, right? And the winner takes all. But in this case, it didn't. In this case, it didn't. Now, we were still going to fight the English one more time, right? The War of 1812 was still in our headlines. But at least in the case of the Oregon Territory, we were willing to. And what happened was that we both claimed ownership. It was called joint occupancy, right? And as far as I know, not a drop of blood was ever shed over the Oregon Territory between the United States and Great Britain. And of course, we know that eventually, and we'll talk about that. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We will discover that the United States takes sole possession of it a little bit later. The United States backs off of that. I'm sorry, Great Britain backs off their claim to the Oregon Territory. Okay. During this time, divisions began to occur within the Republican Party. Uh, by this time, now the Federalist Party still exists, but the Federalist Party is very quickly losing power. It's very quickly losing strength. Excuse me, got to get your nose. And so, by the time that Jefferson becomes the president, Federalists represent only about 1/4 of all of the seats in the entire Congress, the entire House of Representatives, and the entire Senate. Um, the Republicans have really a super majority. They can do pretty much what they choose to because they have the numbers, and the Federalists don't have the numbers to stop the Republicans. And so the Republicans are pretty much in charge. And you would think that because the Republicans had all of this power, that they would be able to do everything they wanted to for the good of the nation. But if you thought that, you would be wrong. The Republicans began to argue over what should be done by their party. Rather than coming together and deciding what to do, they bickered and argued among themselves. They began to, an academic like myself would say, they lost their cohesion. James Madison wrote his good friend James Monroe, and this is what Madison said. The Republicans, having lost the cement given to their union by the rivalship of the Federalist Party, have fallen in many places into schism. All right, let me spell that one for you. Schisms. Usually, when we talk about schisms, we talk about religious schisms. You know, I'm a Southern Baptist, and Southern Baptists are always bickering with each other. As a matter of fact, a lot, especially those of you who are Southern Baptists, I'm sure will agree that the technique that's used by Southern Baptists to create new churches is arguing and getting mad at each other, right? Um, the little church that I attended for years out in Pumpkin Center came into existence because uh, other members of a different church didn't. They argued over the style of music to sing in services, and so part of those who wanted one style of music picked up and they left, right, and created their own church. There was a schism there. I'm not going to name names. But this was sort of indicative that, United States has always, well, we're going to talk about a time when it didn't, but the United States generally has always had a two-party system. Now, the names of the parties might vary over the years. Remember the first two-party system? The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Um, Remember that Washington really would have preferred that everybody agree with everybody else, that everybody believed the same stuff politically? Well, I say that that's rather naive, and this is a really good example that when one party and only one party is in charge is not necessarily a good thing. Problems are going to pop up. Um, and this supports my theory that the two party system is good for American politics and it's good for the American people because when one party is in charge, not a lot gets done when you would think that a lot would get done. Now, at about the same time that all this is going on, war is really getting heated up in Europe. The problems that the Republicans were having with the Federalists and the problems that the Republicans were having with the Republicans, as it turned out, was pretty small potatoes compared to the problems that were being caused in Europe against the United States by the Napoleonic War. By 1805, Napoleon had had victory after victory after victory as it tried to conquer the continent of Europe. They'd had victories against Russia, they'd had victories against Austria. Napoleon was fundamentally in charge of Western Europe by 1805. Also, but, but, also in 1805, something else happened. England, Great Britain, has has wonderful naval victories against the Spanish and the French fleets, especially at the Battle of Trafalgar. Let me spell that one for you: Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar was a huge British win against the combined navies of Spain and of France. France had invaded Spain, and now the French were using the Spanish ships and the Spanish crews to fight England. Now, something interesting happens here. Of course, I'm a historian, so all this stuff is interesting. I hope it's interesting to you too. What this means in the long run is that France and its allies have conquered Europe. They've conquered the soil of Europe. England has is in control of the oceans surrounding Europe. And so fundamentally what happens is there's a tie. There is this standoff. Napoleon, who has this huge army, cannot cross the English Channel. He dreams about it, but he never is able to do it. Uh, and the British, even though they have the most powerful navy in the world, they cannot translate that navy power into army power. So it's sort of a standoff. It's a tie. It's reminiscent of what happens again in World War II between Germany on one side and the Allies on the other, especially in the early years of the war. Now, we've mentioned this. Let me repeat this. American businessmen had grown rich and fat because of the Napoleonic Wars. Um, it had been the official policy. Neutrality had been the official policy of the United States since George Washington. And now it's been, 10 years or so. And we are still trying to, pardon me, to maintain that neutrality. In other words, we are trying, it doesn't matter who's fighting each other in Europe, we're trying to stay out of that fight. And we're also trying to continue to trade, to do business with anybody who will do business with us. But the English especially begin to resent that. Yeah, the French resent it too, but it's not like the British do. England passes a series of laws that says that, no, wait a minute, let me do it a different way. France and Spain, which were allies, even though the Spanish were not crazy about it, the French and the Spanish were shipping their goods to American ports, right? And then those same goods would be sent on American ships all over the world. And the reasoning behind it is that the American ships were neutral ships, and they would be able to trade with whoever they wanted to. But the reality, the effect of this, is that it damaged the English war effort because the Spanish and the French were sending their stuff to America, where the Americans bought the stuff. So that money went into the French and the Spanish pockets, and then it could be used to finance the war. And then the Americans would sell it wherever they wanted to. Well, the English got sick of it. And I must say that I don't blame them. So, uh, England passed a series of laws that said shipping French and Spanish goods through American ports did not neutralize them, right? Uh, that you couldn't, the Spanish and the French couldn't use that trick to neutralize their goods. After 1807, England began to interfere with American shipping, not only to keep supplies out of the hands of Napoleon, but also to stop competition between the United States and British businessmen. I mean, even during war, business continues, right? The British Navy also put into place a blockade of European ports. especially the ports of France and the ports of countries that had been conquered by France. All right, the British Navy was now blockading those French ports and the ports of French allies. The French respond with a blockade of their own. They begin to blockade the ports of England. Now, what this does, it puts the United States into a difficult economic position. If they obey the laws of England, they're going to make the French mad. And if they obey the laws of France, they're going to make the British mad. So what happens is the Americans ignore both. And they continue to send their goods to both England and to France, except now it's illegal. Now, instead of being uh, open about being businessmen, now they become smugglers. They're smuggling American goods into Europe, to England, into France. Now, why do the Americans continue to do this? Well, because the profits were huge. Um, the continent of Europe was being devastated by the Napoleonic Wars. A lot of stuff was that had been manufactured on the continent of Europe was no longer being manufactured because the war, the factories were destroyed. Uh, the United States was one of the few sources of stuff. And what is the first law of economics? When the uh, when the scarcity of an item goes up, right? When something becomes rare, what happens to the price of it? It also goes up. With the United States being one of the few places from where Europeans could buy stuff, and of course you understand that's a technical term, right? Stuff. American shippers, American businessmen were able to charge more for the same thing that they had before, and they were getting rich and they were making money hand over fist. Now, there's a downside to the smuggling, though. If you're caught, you're going to lose your ship, you're going to lose your cargo, you're going to lose everything. Now, we had mentioned this before, but let me go into more detail about it now. Remember that it's only been about 20 years since the United States and England stopped fighting the American Revolution. Now, you say 20 years, that's a long time. And that's because you're probably 20 years old. And to you, that literally is a lifetime. But for some old coot like me, 20 years, that's a drop in the bucket. Um, I don't look at 20 years in the past as ancient history. To me, that's something that just happened. Many Americans were still very aware that there had only been 20 years since the American Revolution. So did the British, for that matter. Now, remember that America is a child of England. They are our mother country. I mentioned this as well the other day, but please permit me to repeat myself. I don't know how long it takes for a person to drop the accent of their former country, but there were a lot of people who were living in the United States who were born and reared in England. And I don't think that 20 years is enough to get rid of the accent. What happens is the British government begins to see all these American ships and they assume that they're smugglers. We're not talking about United States Navy ships. Not yet. We will, but not yet. When I say U.S. ships, I'm talking about what we refer to as merchant vessels. In other words, they're civilian ships that are owned by civilian businessmen. Remember, the both the French and the English have declared an embargo, if you will, on all American shipping. And so the British government, the British Navy, begins to stop American ships on the high seas and inspect them to see where they're going and what they're carrying. Plus, the British. Now that's bad enough, right? That's unacceptable to the Americans, and that's bad enough. But there's more to the story. They also begin to inspect the crews to see if any of the American sailors or the sailor who's sailing on the American ship is in fact British. And if they can find one who speaks with a British accent, they automatically assume that he is a deserter from the British Navy. Now, he might be, but he might not be, right? But they assume that if you speak with a British accent, you are, in fact, a British deserter. And you know what happens to deserters. Bad things happen to deserters. And so they begin to take these sailors off these American ships and bring them back to England. Now, sometimes they just force them to rejoin the British Navy if they can prove they're a deserter. But sometimes, if they can prove they're a deserter, they hang them until they're dead. And this idea of the British taking these sailors off the American ships has a special name. There's a special term that describes it. It's called impressment. 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 Um, Basically, it's kidnapping, and it was used by British sea captains many British sea captains left England with an undersized crew. And so, when they stopped the American ship, especially if they could find somebody who spoke with a British accent, they would impress them into the British Navy. And that helped the sea captain because that meant that experienced sailors were now a part of the British Navy. The British always believed once an Englishman, always an Englishman. Whether that's right or whether that's wrong, it really doesn't matter. That is what they thought. Now, things started to get out of hand, though. Now, the Americans were getting very angry with this entire idea of impressment uh, when the British Navy stopped the American merchant civilian ships. But in 1807, it got worse because in 1807, a British ship by the name of the Leopard, right, stopped a ship, but it wasn't a merchant ship. It was an American Navy ship. It was called the Chesapeake. The British captain uh, demanded that the American captain let him search the American ship, and the American captain refused. Of course he did. That's better. The American captain had the right, of course, to deny the British captain the right to come on board and inspect the crew. Now, what was the British captain looking for? He was looking for American sailors with British accents. Of course he was. When the American captain refused to let the British captain on board the Chesapeake, the Leopard fired its cannon at the Chesapeake. And they didn't just fire the cannon. They killed 3 American sailors and wounded an additional 18. And it forced the Chesapeake to surrender. When the British came on board and they examined the crew, they arrested 4 men, one of whom they later hung for desertion, and the other 3 that they impressed into the British Navy. Now, you can imagine the outrage and the uproar that resulted from the Leopard basically attacking the Chesapeake for no reason. War fever broke out all over the United States. Many Americans wanted to fight another war against the British. But Jefferson understood how weak, because of his own actions now, Jefferson understood how weak our Army and our Navy was. And so he resisted this call by many Americans to go to war against the British. Now, his refusal to go to war damaged him politically. Instead of going to war with England, Jefferson tried um, another tactic. And the result was what we still call the Jefferson Embargo. The Jefferson Embargo. Jefferson attempted to, and remember, Americans are outraged at the actions of the British. And so, and Jefferson doesn't want to go to war with them because he knows what the result of that would be. It would be a terrible defeat for us because there won't be any French to come to our assistance this time, right? The French have enough on their plate fighting the British. The French don't want to have to fight the Americans who are weak, but nevertheless, they don't want to have to fight the Americans and the British. All right. Jefferson attempts to channel that outrage in a productive path, what he called peaceable coercion. And this is the form that the Jefferson Embargo took. The Congress passes a piece of legislation called the Embargo Act in December of 1807. Now, Jefferson was of the opinion that American business, American commerce, was critical to the British economy. That England's economy could not flourish without stuff that America was sending there. Now, think of the things that America was sending to England. Most appreciably, most especially, cotton. Remember that before around 1795, cotton was an unimportant product to America because of the difficulty of separating the cotton seed from the cotton fiber. But we said that around 1795, 1796, a machine was perfected that would separate the cotton seed from the cotton fiber. And as a result of that, cotton production takes off in the United States. Cotton cultivation had been a minor product, it had been a minor crop before the perfection of the cotton gin. And by the time of 1805, 1806, 1807, and that's where we are now, cotton was becoming really, really important to the American economy, but it was important to the British economy too. Why? Well, the first industrial revolution started in England. Now, I'm not going to give you an economics 101 lesson here, but uh, water powered mills in England and up in Scotland began to take American cotton and twist it into thread and then use those threads to weave beautiful cotton fabric. Cotton fabric becomes more and more and more common during this time period. England is the world's largest producer of cotton fabric. And most of the cotton that they are weaving into cloth is American cotton. So you can understand that why Jefferson would think now, and there are other things too. I mean, all the fish that the people of New England are catching and selling to the British, the naval stores that we are producing and selling to the British, the tobacco that we are producing and selling to the British. Most of that stuff they can't provide for themselves. They got to buy it from somebody, and they would just as soon buy it from us because we are one of their ex-colonies. So Jefferson believes that the British commerce is deeply dependent upon American products, even if they're just raw products, right? He said that uh, American commerce was so critical to England that it's stopping the flow of American raw material to England would force England to stop the blockade and to permit American ships to resume stopping at all European ports. In other words, America would be permitted to remain neutral and trade with everybody. So, the idea was a good one. The idea was a really good idea. But in order for it to work, in order for the Jeffersonian embargo to work, meant that all American goods that had been going to England had to stop. There would be a ban on all American goods going to England. That's exactly what the embargo did. It stopped all export of all American goods and it banned the United States ships from going to foreign ports. Why did it do that? Are we trying to punish just the British? Well, yeah, we are trying to punish just the British, but if you were able to send American cotton to a Spanish colony, then the Spanish colony could turn right around and send it to England, and the English wouldn't be hurt. They would still get their cotton, wouldn't they? So, in order to make it work, not only did we need to hurt England, but we needed to hurt America too. Okay, let me say it again. It stopped all exports of all American goods, excuse me, and it banned United States ships from going to foreign ports. Now, what was the impact of the embargo? Well, you could probably see this coming. It was a disaster. It was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. It was a failure from the beginning. The public was unwilling to make the sacrifices that were necessary, that were required by the embargo to make the embargo work, right? You can't blame the American people, but the reality is that it was never supported by the American people. As a matter of fact, American businessmen ignored the embargo, and they continued. This time, they were smuggling cotton and all this other stuff into England as well, right? The entire episode damaged Jefferson politically. The Federalist Party had been well on its way to dying, but the Jefferson embargo sort of resurrected it, at least in the short term. The Federalists, just like some politicians today, they said, never let never let an emergency go to waste. Use it for political purposes, right? The Federalists accused the Republicans of being in league with the French. No, no, they weren't. They were simply trying to stop the British blockade. Now, did it actually help the French to do that? Probably. But that was not the purpose of the purpose of the Jefferson's embargo was not to help the French, it was to damage the British. But the Federalists accused the Republicans of being in league with the French. Agriculture in the South and in the West suffered because uh, e- even though smuggling continued, much of America's commerce from America to other parts of the world did, in fact, stop. The crops, there was no need to raise a crop, was there? If you couldn't, if you were fortunate, you could sell it here in America. But the chances are likely that if you're raising cotton, for example, and tobacco, you're not going to sell all this stuff in America. You need to sell it to other nations, especially England. So agriculture in the South and in the Western states, especially, suffered because there were no more legal export markets for cotton, for tobacco. And here's one that I've not even mentioned. Let's throw it into the equation. Grain, right? Wheat, corn. After the embargo had been in place for 15 months, just a bit more than a year, Jefferson signed a repeal of it in March of 1809. Now, let me tell you something. Let's follow up that story. As it turned out, Jefferson was right. It would not sending our stuff to England would damage the British economy. Now, what he hoped was that it would damage the British economy so badly that the British would stop the blockade of American ports and they would permit us to trade with whoever we wanted to trade. But Jefferson realized that he was being damaged domestically by the embargo, that the American people didn't like it, and he canceled it. But the reality is, we didn't know then, but we know now that it was working. As a matter of fact, the British government was in the process of creating legislation that would have done exactly what Jefferson hoped. It would have stopped the blockade of American ports, and it would have permitted Americans to trade everywhere. But we made the move first. We canceled the embargo before the English could act. And so it seems that Jefferson had made a really bad move. As it turned out, well, and but he had not misjudged the British. He predicted what the British would do. What he did was he misjudged the American people. Americans have always voted with their pocketbooks. I'm convinced of that. I believe that economics drives politics. And when your pocketbook suffers, you're probably going to be quite willing to replace the people who caused that to happen with people who promise you, whether they can do it or not, but they at least promise you that they're going to fix stuff. All right. The election of 1808 rolls around. No, I'm sorry, we can't avoid politics. We've got to keep talking about this. The election of 1808 rolls around. Jefferson has been president for 8 years, or almost 8 years. Now, could Jefferson have been elected to a third term? Could he have run and been elected? Well, yeah. He chose not to. Why did he choose not to? Because he followed the pattern that had been established earlier by George Washington. Serve 2 terms and retire. That's exactly what Jefferson decides to do. He's going to go home and go back to farming and go back to doing the scientific studies and all those things that Jefferson is famous for doing. Now, Madison, James Madison, was also from Virginia, as was Jefferson. The two were close friends. Remember that the two men together, had created the Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party. And so everyone knew that Madison would be Jefferson's choice to replace him in the White House. Now, Madison was not the unanimous choice of the Republican Party. He was popular, but it was not unanimous. 60 Republican congressmen didn't want Madison to be president. Now, let's talk about politics back then and compare it a little bit to now. And this is the perfect time to make this comparison because right now, the Republican National Convention, well, it ended last night, but it's been going on all week. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. The Democratic nomination convention ended last night, and the Republican National Convention is going to start next week. Um, of course, we already knew who the Democratic candidate for president was going to be, Joe Biden. And we already know who the Republican candidate for president is going to be, Donald Trump. Uh, but that's not all. That's not always been the case. Back in the days of Jefferson, there were no national nominating conventions. Nobody had those. We will talk about the creation of the national nominating conventions when we get to the proper place. No, we won't. No, that happens after the limits of this course are over. Okay, so all the way through this time period, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, um, there are no nominating conventions. So how are candidates chosen? Well, there are a number of ways. One of the ways to choose candidates back then was members of the Congress would get together and they would decide who they would like to see as president. And that's what happened in the year 1808. There was a congressional caucus, if you will, of 60 men who met in opposition, not in favor of Madison, but in opposition to him. So there was opposition to Madison, but it was not enough opposition to really endanger him becoming the Republican candidate for the presidency in the year 1808. There was another candidate for the Republicans. His name was George Clinton. Clinton was the governor of the state of New York at the time. Um, but the Republican Clinton was uh, old and he was in really bad health. And so he really never did offer a serious opposition to Madison. Um, there was a Federalist candidate, even though the Federalist Party was getting weaker and weaker and weaker. In the year 1808, they did offer a candidate for the presidency, and it was our old friend C.C. Pinckney, Charles C. Pinckney. Now, Pinckney was a terrible candidate. He was a weak candidate for a weak party. And so, for all practical intents and purposes, everyone knew that whoever the nominee of the Republican Party was going to be was also probably going to be elected. About the only place where the Federalist Party still had any appreciable strength was in New England. And that will come into play as we continue to discuss the War of 1812. Well, nevertheless, Madison is elected over Charles C. Pinckney in 1808. I'll give you the electoral numbers. I'm not going to ask you to remember these. I just want you to understand that the election really wasn't close in the Electoral College. Madison gets 122 electoral votes, while Pinckney gets 47. So it's about 2.5 to 1 if you want to do the little ratio thingy. All right. And from the very beginning of his presidency, James Madison gets involved in foreign affairs. He has to hit the ground running because bad things happened to him because of foreign entanglements. All right, let's talk about Madison in the 10 minutes or so that we have left in this particular lecture. I've always been fascinated by James Madison. I would like to say that I'm equally fascinated by all U.S. presidents, but that's not true. We all have favorites, and I just love James Madison. Don't know why, I can't tell you. Um, he was inaugurated just a few days short of his 58th birthday. He was a bachelor, he'd never been married. Um, he was a little guy. I mean, little, like a sparrow, right? He was short, and he had little bones. Uh, and at his inauguration, he seemed even more tired and more weak than normal. Um, Now, by the time he becomes the president, he has married, and he's married a widow by the name of Dolly Madison, and two more different people have never existed on the face of the earth. He was quiet and subdued and withdrawn and scholarly and intellectual and all those things, right? Dolly was like a social butterfly. She just flitted from one flower and from one dance to the next. She liked to dress in colorful dresses and evening gowns, and he dressed always in just black and white. The contrast was striking. He was born to a very wealthy Virginia family. He was the oldest um, of how many children? His mama had 12 children. That's amazing that she survived the childbirth of 12 children. Now, he's the oldest. Um, his mama, by the way, not only was it amazing that she gave successfully, didn't having 12 babies didn't kill her, but she lived to the age of 97, which tells us that the chances were that Madison would live to be an old man, and he did, by the way. He was a child of privilege, wealthy family. He had no financial worries. I've never been able to say that. I still worry about financial things, right? After all these years. But he didn't have to worry. He always knew where his next meal was coming from. He was a child of privilege. That's a good way to say that. Um, he had little to no interest in running the family plantation. That just wasn't his cup of tea. Rather, he decided at a rather young age that he'd like to become a politician. Now, let me stop right here and tell you that back in those days, being a politician didn't automatically mean that you were crooked or something like that. Um, Politics had interested him from an early age, and he wanted to be active in politics, and he was able to because he was wealthy. He could do what he chose to do. He could have laid around and drank coffee all of his life if that's what he had wanted to do. He chose to educate himself. He did so at a local school there in Virginia. Um, and that school was unique in Virginia because the curriculum was a difficult curriculum. It wasn't just reading and writing and arithmetic, it was much more than that. He spent 5 years there studying logic and philosophy, math, astronomy, and French. Now, here's this is funny, I think. His French teacher at that little school was from Scotland. So he taught James Madison how to speak French for the rest of his life. When James Madison spoke French, he spoke it very well, but he spoke it with a Scot accent. And that had to be funny to hear that. He decided he wanted to go to college. Now, Virginia had a good school. William and Mary had already been established in Virginia, but he wanted to go to the best school that was available. And so he decided to go to the University of New Jersey. which later changed his name to Princeton. So he went to Princeton. He was introduced to the writings of Adam Smith and David Hume, two Enlightenment philosophers. Uh, and Adam Smith was an economist, and the studies that he had there at Princeton would shape his political life, would shape his economic philosophy as well. He graduated a year early. He was a precocious student. He could do something that I wish that I could do. He had a photographic memory. He remembered everything he ever read. Boy, I have trouble remembering what I read last night, much less everything that I've ever read. Yet it was not his reading. It was not his reading that completed his that completed his political education. It was the Revolutionary War that did that. By 1774, Madison was back out of he was out of the university. He was back home in Virginia at the family mansion at Montpelier. And it was during this time, of course, that the call for independence from England was becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. It was during this time that many of the things that we have all studied uh, take place. The Boston Tea Party and the intolerable acts and all of those things are taking place. And Madison is a young man, but he's with really strong political views, and he's observing all of this stuff go down. In December of 1774, he is appointed to what was his first really political office. It was not an election, it was an appointment. He was appointed to the Orange County, Virginia Committee of Safety. And as a member of that Committee of Safety, pardon me, he was instrumental in forming a boycott of British goods. Remember that we stopped buying the fancy cloth from England and we started wearing the homespun. We stopped buying the tea from England and started buying these probably very nasty homemade teas. He was commissioned in the county militia. Now, come on, James Madison as a soldier, he probably was so weak he couldn't carry one of those old Brown Bess muskets. It probably weighed as much as he did, but nevertheless, he was in the militia. Um, Being in the militia probably, I've been told that he got there because of his father's influence, right? It wasn't because that people recognized that he was cut out to be a soldier. In the spring of 1776, things began to get serious politically for James Madison. He was elected as a delegate to the Virginia Provincial Convention, and it was as a member of that convention that James Madison really discovered politics. More and more colonials, even in Virginia, began to support independence more and more. While he served in the Virginia Provincial Convention, he met other influential Virginians. He met George Mason, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Now, he was much younger than they were. And he pretty much stayed on the sidelines and kept his mouth shut and his ears open. But he was learning. And even though he didn't realize it, he was coming to the attention of those men that I just mentioned. They had their eyes on him. They considered him to be a member of the new generation of colonial leaders. In 1776, no, I'm going to stop there. Okay, let's stop right there. All right. This is the end of, and I always need to check because I didn't do this last semester and I messed up the numbering. This has been lecture number 7. All right. We will pick up with lecture number 8, and we will continue to talk about James Madison's introduction to politics and his influence on American national politics. And I'll see you then.